I didn't expect the white elephant gift I picked to know more about me than anyone in that room should have. The office holiday party was typical. Bad punch, too many novelty sweaters, and awkward conversations with coworkers I barely knew. I'd been at the company for 6 months, so I wasn't exactly part of the inner circle, but a white elephant exchange seemed harmless enough. I'd brought a generic gift myself, a mug with a cheesy "World's Okayest Employee" slogan. I figured I'd leave with something equally forgettable. When my turn came, I chose a medium-sized box wrapped in plain red paper. It didn't stand out among the gaudy ribbons and glittery bows, but something about its simplicity caught my eye. My coworkers cheered me on, laughing and sipping wine as I tore through the paper. Inside was a yearbook. At first, I thought it was random, part of some elaborate joke, but as I opened the cover, my breath caught. My name was scrawled inside in the same loopy handwriting I hadn't used in years. The notes, the doodles, the messages from classmates. I knew every detail. It was my yearbook, the one I thought I'd lost during a move years ago. I flipped through the pages in disbelief, my pulse quickening. My fingers brushed over a folded corner on a page I didn't remember folding. Beneath it was a photo of my sophomore math class, my younger self smiling awkwardly in the back row. My coworkers' laughter faded into background noise. "How?" I muttered. "Something wrong?" someone asked, their tone light but curious. This is mine," I said, holding it up. "It's my actual yearbook." The room went quiet for a moment before a few nervous chuckles broke the silence. "Nice touch, whoever brought it," someone joked. "Creepy, but clever." But I wasn't laughing. I dug deeper into the box and pulled out the next item. A photo of my childhood home. It was taken from the street, the angle so familiar it made my stomach twist. My family's old blue station wagon was parked in the driveway, just as it had been before we moved. The photo looked recent. The colors were too crisp, the image too sharp. And then, at the bottom of the box, I found a scarf. Soft gray wool, faintly worn. My grandmother had given it to me when I was 18. I'd lost it during my first year of college and thought it was gone forever. Now it was here, folded neatly, as though it had never left my possession. I ran my fingers over the fabric. It felt colder than I remembered, as though it had just been pulled from a snowdrift. "All right, who's behind this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Seriously, who brought this?" The room erupted in confused murmurs. A few people laughed awkwardly, assuming I was in on some kind of joke. Others looked genuinely puzzled. "I thought it was yours," Sarah, the party host, said. "Didn't you bring it?" "No," I snapped. "I didn't." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. People started describing their gifts: candles, bottles of wine, a ridiculous reindeer hat. No one admitted to bringing the red box. "I mean, it's just a game," Kyle, one of the sales guys, said, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe someone's playing a prank." "A prank?" I said, my voice rising. "How would they even get this stuff? This is my scarf, my yearbook, my—" I held up the photo of my house. "This is personal." For a moment, no one spoke. The room felt colder somehow, as though the warmth of the party had seeped out entirely. Then Sarah stepped forward, trying to smooth things over. "It's probably just a coincidence," she said, though her voice didn't sound convincing. "Let's move on to the next gift, okay?" I stayed quiet for the rest of the party, watching my coworkers as they laughed and opened gifts. No one seemed nervous or guilty. No one even glanced at me again. By the time I left, the tension had settled into a heavy weight in my chest. At home, I laid the items out on my kitchen table: the yearbook, the photo, the scarf. Each one felt like a piece of my life had been stolen and returned without my consent. That's when I noticed the folded page in the yearbook again. I opened it, and a small square of paper fell out, fluttering to the table. My breath hitched as I picked it up. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, like it had been scrawled in haste, or with trembling hands. "Merry Christmas. It's nice to see you again." My hands trembled as I reread the note. Again. Who was this person? And how long had they been watching me? I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, the police maybe, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That someone had left me a box of my own belongings and a cryptic note. I stared at the items, feeling more exposed than I ever had in my life. Every Christmas since, I've been careful to avoid gift exchanges. I no longer decorate with the scarf, and I keep the yearbook hidden in a drawer. But every December, when the snow begins to fall, I can't shake the feeling that someone out there is still watching. And this year, I found something else in the mail. No return address, no note, just a small plain box. I haven't opened it yet, and I don't think I will. When the Petersons asked me to dog sit over Christmas, I thought it'd be easy money. Feed Max, let him out a few times a day, and keep an eye on the house while they were out of town. I'd done it before, and the hardest part was finding the TV remote in their cluttered living room. But that year, something was different. From the start, the house felt colder than usual. Not just physically, it had this stillness, like the air was too heavy. The Petersons' decorations were up, lights strung on the banister, stockings over the fireplace, a glowing tree in the corner. But the cheerfulness felt hollow, as though it were trying too hard to cover something up. The basement door, though, that was what really got to me. It was an old scuffed thing tucked into the hallway between the kitchen and the laundry room. I didn't remember noticing it before, but this time, every time I walked past, I felt its presence like it was staring at me. I joked to myself that it was just my imagination. The Petersons hadn't said anything about it, and I wasn't about to ask. The first 2 nights went smoothly. Max was an angel, and I spent most of the time scrolling through my phone on their couch while the fireplace crackled. But on the 3rd night, as the wind picked up outside, I heard something. At first, I thought it was Max shifting in his sleep, but then I heard it again, a faint rhythmic thumping, low and deliberate, coming from below. Max's head shot up. He let out a low growl, staring at the basement door. I laughed nervously, trying to calm him down. "It's just the furnace, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. He didn't relax. His eyes stayed locked on the door. The noise came again, louder this time, a slow scrape, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. By the time I grabbed a flashlight and opened the basement door, my heart was pounding. Cold air rushed up and the narrow stairs disappeared into darkness. Max stayed behind me, pacing nervously. He barked once, sharp and frantic, before retreating to the living room. "Coward," I muttered, though I wasn't feeling much braver. The stairs creaked as I descended, the smell of damp wood growing stronger. My flashlight's beam darted across the space, illuminating stacks of boxes and old furniture. The room felt smaller than I remembered, the walls pressing in too tightly. I was about to turn back when the noise came again, this time from the far corner. That's when I saw it. A small, nearly hidden door, tucked behind a shelf. The paint was peeling and the handle was rusted. It didn't look like it had been touched in years. But as I reached for it, the air around me shifted. The space felt alive, like the basement itself was holding its breath. My hand hovered over the handle, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I didn't. I couldn't. The door opened with a creak and the smell hit me immediately, musty and sour, like wet earth and decay. The room beyond was pitch black, but as I swept my flashlight across the walls, I froze. Photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned and taped in uneven rows. The images were a mix of the familiar and the invasive. Houses from the neighborhood, families in their yards, kids playing in the snow. Some were taken through windows, showing people in their kitchens, bedrooms, living rooms. And then there were the ones of me. One of me walking to school last fall. Another of me mowing the lawn. But the one that made my chest tighten was taken just last week. Me sitting in my own living room, scrolling through my phone. The angle was high, as if the photographer had been standing just outside the window. I staggered back, the flashlight beam shaking in my hands. That's when I noticed the desk in the corner of the room. On it were an old camera and a notebook. I opened the notebook, and my stomach turned. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, times, dates, descriptions of routines, my routines. 4:15 p.m., walks home from school, alone, usually distracted. 7:30 p.m., sitting on couch by fireplace, dog nearby. I flipped the page, my breathing shallow, and found something worse. Sketches. Crude, chaotic drawings of faces, houses, and something else. A shadowy figure with long fingers and blank eyes, drawn over and over again. Behind me, something scraped against the concrete. I spun around, the flashlight darting across the room. The door was still open, but Max was barking frantically upstairs. Whatever courage I'd had evaporated. I bolted, slamming the door behind me, and sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time. I called the Petersons in a panic, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain what I'd found. They were shocked, swearing they had no idea about the hidden room. They told me to leave the house immediately and said they'd call the police. The officers arrived within minutes. I stood outside with Max, shivering in the snow as they searched the house. When they came back up, their faces were grim. "The room's empty," one of them said. "No photos, no camera, no notebook. Nothing but a few scuff marks on the floor." "But I saw it," I stammered. "It was all there. The photos, The officer held up a single photograph, taken from the basement floor. It showed me standing at the top of the stairs, holding the flashlight, my face pale with fear. The Petersons moved out a few months later. I don't blame them. I haven't dog-sat since, and I avoid their old house every time I walk through the neighborhood. But every so often, when I'm alone, I feel it. That same heavy stillness, like I'm being watched. And sometimes, I wonder if whoever, or whatever, was in that basement has found someone else to photograph. Last Christmas, I finally went all out with decorations. My house was the brightest on the block, covered in strings of multicolored lights that wrapped around the porch, framed the windows, and climbed up to the roof. It took an entire weekend to put them up, but it was worth it. Every night people slowed down as they drove past, admiring the display. I even caught a couple of neighbors taking pictures from the sidewalk. It was the kind of small joy I needed that year. Or at least, that's what I thought. The trouble started about a week before Christmas. I was sitting in the living room, half watching a Christmas movie, when I noticed the lights outside flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. Christmas lights are finicky, and I figured it was a loose bulb or a bad connection. But as I kept watching, I realized the flickering wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic. 3 quick flashes, a pause, 2 slow blinks. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cold biting through the thin fabric. My breath came out in quick, foggy puffs as I stood on the porch, staring at the lights. The pattern was the same. 3 quick flashes, a pause, then 2 slow blinks, over and over again. I frowned and tried to shake off the strange unease creeping into my chest. Maybe it was interference from another set of lights in the neighborhood, or a glitch in the timers. But something about it felt off. The ladder was still propped against the side of the house from when I'd put the lights up. I climbed it cautiously, the rungs creaking under my weight, slick with frost. At the roofline, I inspected the strand. Nothing seemed unusual, just a tangle of wires and bulbs. Still, a strange sensation crawled up my neck, like I was being watched. I decided to check the cords and plugs instead, shaking off the unease as best I could. Maybe a squirrel had chewed through something, or there was a short circuit. But everything looked fine. Eventually, I went back inside, figuring I'd deal with it in the morning. But the lights weren't done with me. The next evening, the same flickering pattern returned. 3 quick flashes, a pause, 2 slow blinks. This time, I sat on the couch and watched them, determined to make sense of it. The realization came slowly, and when it did, my stomach dropped. The pattern wasn't coming from all the lights. It was only coming from the strand strung across the roofline, directly above my bedroom window. I felt the first real spike of fear then, sharp and cold, twisting in my chest. Still, I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence. Maybe one of the bulbs was faulty, or there was some kind of interference. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights flashing behind my eyelids. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with increasingly ridiculous explanations. Was it a prank? A neighbor messing with me? Or something more sinister? Around midnight, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to check the lights again, just to be sure. The ladder was still where I'd left it. I climbed it slowly this time, my breath hitching with each creak of the rungs. The air was so cold it stung my face, and the flashlight in my hand trembled slightly as I scanned the strand of lights. At first, everything seemed normal. Just bulbs and wires, coated in a thin layer of frost. But then I saw it. Tucked between the wires was a small black object, about the size of a deck of cards. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out and touched it. It wasn't a light bulb. It was cold, smooth, and heavier than I expected when I pulled it free. It was a camera. My hands shook as I climbed back down, the camera gripped tightly in one hand. Inside, I set it on the kitchen table and examined it more closely. It was sleek and modern, with no markings or logos, designed to blend in, to be nearly invisible. The lens was angled downward, aimed directly at my bedroom window. My stomach churned as the questions hit me all at once. How long had it been there? Who had put it there? And most importantly, what had they been watching? I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours scanning the rest of the lights with my flashlight, going strand by strand, but I didn't find any more cameras. Still, the damage was done. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the camera, my mind spinning in endless circles. The next morning, I called the police. 2 officers arrived within an hour, their uniforms stiff and cold-looking against the morning frost. They examined the camera, asked a few questions, and promised to look into it. But as the days passed, I didn't hear anything. No leads, no suspects, nothing. I took down the Christmas lights that same day. The house felt empty and cold without them, but I couldn't stand to leave them up, knowing someone had used them to spy on me. A week later, I got a call from the police. The officer on the other end sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "We weren't able to trace the camera," he said, "but there's something you should know." "What?" I asked, my heart pounding. "There was footage on the camera," he said slowly. "Most of it was just the outside of your house. But the last few files, they were recorded through your bedroom window." My stomach lurched. "Through the window?" "What was on them?" The officer hesitated. "Just you, sitting on your bed, sleeping, getting ready in the morning." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. "Do you have any idea who did this?" "No," he admitted. "But whoever it was, they were watching you for a while. It's been a year now, and I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. I installed security cameras and changed all the locks, but it hasn't helped. Every time I pass a window, I feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. Every time I see Christmas lights, I feel a knot of dread in my stomach. This year, I didn't decorate at all. The house is dark and plain, and I tell people I didn't have time. But the truth is, I can't bring myself to string up those lights again. Because somewhere out there, someone saw me, and I'm terrified they might be watching still." It was 3 days before Christmas, and the mall parking lot was a war zone. Cars circled like vultures, brake lights flashing as drivers fought over every open space. After 20 minutes of looping, I found a spot near the far edge of the lot, tucked behind a line of frost-covered trees. It felt quieter, safer, away from the chaos. At the time, I thought it was the best I could do. I locked the car, double-checked even, and made my way toward the mall, clutching my coat against the biting wind. The parking lot seemed ordinary enough, just rows of cars shimmering under the flickering glow of overhead lights. I didn't know then that I'd regret leaving my car there. The mall was a madhouse, kids screaming on Santa's lap, harried shoppers barreling past with overloaded carts, Christmas music blaring from every corner. By the time I'd grabbed the last of my gifts and made my way back to the parking lot, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The air was sharper now, stinging my lungs with every breath. I clutched my bags tightly, my boots crunching through patches of ice as I approached my car. Everything seemed normal at first, but as I got closer, something caught my eye. There was someone sitting in the passenger seat. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe I'd mistaken someone else's car for mine. But as I drew closer, I saw him more clearly. A man sitting perfectly still, his face half lit by the flickering overhead light. He was looking straight ahead, his hands resting in his lap, his posture unnaturally stiff. The air seemed to freeze around me. My mind raced. This is my car. I know it's mine. The doors were locked. I locked them. I glanced around the lot hoping to see someone, anyone, but it was nearly deserted. Just rows of cars and the muffled hum of holiday chaos from the mall. My breath fogged in the cold as I forced myself forward. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock the doors. Maybe he'd gotten in while I was distracted. I clung to those explanations, even as my instincts screamed at me to turn around. I stopped a few feet away, gripping the shopping bag so tightly the plastic handles bit into my palms. My eyes locked on the man in the passenger seat. He didn't move. His head was tilted slightly toward the driver's seat, his face pale and blank as though he were waiting for me. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling. As I pulled it out, my foot slipped on the icy pavement, and the phone tumbled to the ground with a muffled thud. The man's head turned. It was slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. His face tilted just enough that I could see it fully now. Smooth, waxy skin, too perfect to be natural, and eyes that seemed to sink too far into his skull. His lips curled into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not a friendly one. Not even human. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The lights overhead buzzed and flickered. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I blinked, and the passenger seat was empty. I gasped, my heart racing, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone in the snow. My legs felt like they might give out, but I forced myself toward the car. The doors were still locked. I unlocked them, flung the driver's side door open, and leaned inside, half expecting the man to lunge at me from the shadows. But there was no one there. Just an empty passenger seat, still wet, as though someone had been sitting there in snow-soaked clothes. On the window, there was the faint outline of a head pressed against the glass. The condensation smeared slightly, like it had been dragged downward. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my pulse pounding as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the snowy trees in the distance. As I pulled out of the spot, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Footprints. They trailed away from the passenger side of the car, cutting a meandering path across the snow-covered lot. The prints disappeared into the shadows of the tree line. I didn't stay to follow them. I drove straight home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel the entire way. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I'd been overtired. Maybe my imagination had gotten the best of me. But as I loaded gifts into the trunk for a trip to my sister's house, I noticed something tucked under the passenger seat. A piece of paper folded into a neat square. My stomach churned as I reached for it. The paper felt damp, as though it had been left in the snow. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers trembling. In jagged, uneven handwriting, it said, "Thanks for letting me in. I haven't parked far from a building since. Every time I get into my car, I check the locks twice. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see a shadow moving behind me in the rearview mirror. But when I turn around, the seat is always empty."
"3 days before Christmas, and our house still didn't have a tree. Without the smell of pine in the air or Sophie's favorite ornaments hanging on the branches, it didn't feel like the season. Work, school, and 100 other errands had swallowed up the month. When we finally decided to get one, the sun had already set. That left us with only one option, the small lot on the edge of town. It wasn't the kind of place we'd usually go. The lot was nearly deserted when we arrived. A sagging string of colored lights flickered weakly overhead, casting uneven shadows over rows of evergreens. The trees stood stiff and silent, their frost-covered branches clinging to one another as if against the cold. Near the entrance sat a shack with peeling paint, illuminated by the faint glow of a single flickering bulb.
The place felt forgotten, like something left behind by time. "Let's make this quick," Laura said, pulling her coat tighter. She shivered, though the car's heater was still on. "This place is giving me the creeps." "It's just a tree lot," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. But her unease mirrored something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sophie didn't seem to notice. She threw open the car door and ran ahead, her boots crunching through the frosted ground as she darted between the trees. "Look at this one," she called, already full of excitement. Laura sighed and followed her, but I stayed back, heading toward the shack to let the worker know we were there. The man who stepped out of the shack made me stop in my tracks. He moved with a deliberate sharpness, as if he'd been waiting for us. He was tall and gaunt, his face carved with deep lines, his hollow eyes unblinking. A heavy coat hung loose on his bony frame, and his boots crunched loudly as he approached. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching me with a faint, crooked smile that stretched his thin lips but didn't touch his eyes. "Looking for a tree?" he asked finally, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Yeah. Do we just..." I gestured toward the rows of trees, feeling suddenly unsure. He nodded, but his eyes didn't follow my gesture. They stayed locked on me, unblinking, even as I turned to join Laura and Sophie. His gaze felt heavy, like it was pressing against my back. Sophie flitted from tree to tree, marveling at each one. "This one," she said finally, pointing to a small tree near the front. "It's perfect." Laura and I exchanged a glance, smiling despite the odd tension in the air. "It's a little small," I said. "Let's see if we can find something taller." Before Sophie could argue, the worker appeared. His boots crunched loudly as he stepped into view, his sudden presence startling all of us. He didn't say anything at first, just gestured toward a tree at the farthest end of the lot. "This one," he said finally, his voice sharper now. "You should take this one." We turned. The tree stood taller than the others, its dark green needles shimmering under the dim lights. It was perfectly symmetrical, its branches full and lush, like something out of a catalog. Sophie tugged at my sleeve. "I don't like it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," the man said sharply, cutting her off. His shadow stretched long across the snow as he stepped closer. "This is the one you want. It's special." His voice had a strange weight to it, a tone that seemed to burrow into my thoughts. I hesitated, glancing at Laura. She frowned but said nothing. "It's late," I said finally, forcing a nervous laugh. "We'll take it." The man's smile deepened, his hollow eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Good choice," he said. We loaded the tree onto the roof of the car. The man helped secure it, his gloved hands lingering on the branches as though he didn't want to let go. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He stood under the flickering lights, his still figure barely distinguishable from the shadows. He didn't wave or turn away. He just watched us leave. At home, the unease started to fade. Sophie chattered excitedly as we set up the tree in the living room, and Laura smiled as she untangled the lights. The tree looked perfect under the soft glow of the Christmas decorations, its branches full and strong. For a while, everything felt normal. But later that night, as I was turning off the lights, something about the tree caught my eye. Near the base of the trunk, just above the stand, the bark looked strange. The grooves were rough, uneven, almost deliberate. I knelt down, running my fingers over the surface. And then I saw it. A face, carved into the bark. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as I leaned closer, the features sharpened. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks. That same crooked smile. It wasn't just any face. It was his. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. "Laura!" I called out, my voice shaking. She came into the room, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" I pointed to the carving. Her face went pale as she knelt beside me, staring at the grotesque image. Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said hoarsely. "It wasn't there before." Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Why are you yelling?" she asked sleepily. Laura moved quickly, blocking her view. "Nothing, sweetie," she said. "Go back to bed." Sophie frowned but obeyed, retreating upstairs. Laura turned back to me, her voice low and sharp. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know," I said. But even as I spoke, I could feel the answer lurking at the edge of my thoughts. I just didn't want to say it. The next morning, I drove back to the lot, determined to find the man. But when I arrived, the lot was empty. The rows of trees were gone. The shack was boarded up, its peeling paint hidden under layers of frost. The string of lights lay tangled on the ground, half buried in snow. It was as though the place had been abandoned for months, not hours. "Looking for something?" a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man bundled in a heavy coat, his breath fogging in the cold. He looked like he worked at the strip mall. "There was a tree lot here last night," I said. "Do you know what happened to it?" The man frowned. "Tree lot? There hasn't been one here all season." I didn't argue. I just got back in my car and drove home. The tree was still in the living room, its branches heavy with ornaments. But the face in the bark seemed deeper now, the grooves more defined, as though it had been carved by a steady, deliberate hand. That night, I dragged it outside. I couldn't bear to look at it any longer. By morning, it was gone. We bought an artificial tree the next year. It doesn't smell like pine, but I don't mind. At least I can sleep at night. It was late on Christmas Eve, and the house was quiet. My wife and kids had gone to bed hours ago, their laughter and excitement replaced by the soft hum of the furnace. I sat alone on the couch, the glow of the Christmas tree the only light in the room. The untouched glass of eggnog on the coffee table had gone warm, but I wasn't in the mood to drink it. The TV droned softly in the background, playing the end of some holiday special. I wasn't paying much attention, just flipping aimlessly through channels, hoping to stumble on something to distract me. Most stations were airing Christmas movies or infomercials, and the occasional burst of static reminded me I still hadn't upgraded to streaming. I was about to turn it off and head to bed when I landed on something that made me pause. It was a black and white channel, the image grainy and slightly distorted. At first, I thought it was an old movie, an indie film maybe, but there was no music, no dialogue, just a single camera angle pointed down a dimly lit street. It looked eerily familiar. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The picture wasn't great, but there was something about the layout of the street, the angles of the houses, the way the trees lined the sidewalk. I reached for the remote and turned up the volume, but all I heard was faint static. My heart skipped as the realization hit me. It wasn't just any street, it was my street. The houses matched perfectly, down to the chipped paint on the corner lot and the Christmas lights blinking unevenly on the neighbor's porch. The camera angle was fixed, the perspective low, like it had been set up on the sidewalk across the street. The screen flickered for a moment, and when the image steadied, I saw movement. A figure appeared from the edge of the frame, stepping into view. The person was wearing dark clothes, a hooded jacket maybe, but the poor quality of the footage made it hard to see any details. They walked slowly, deliberately, their hands in their pockets, their head slightly bowed. I watched, frozen, as the figure moved down the sidewalk, passing the same houses I passed every day. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some weird art project, a prank broadcast by a local college. Or maybe it was an old home video someone had repurposed for public access. But even as I told myself these things, I couldn't look away. The figure stopped in front of a house, their silhouette sharp against the grainy backdrop. My stomach twisted. It was my house. I stood abruptly, my pulse pounding. The figure didn't move for a long moment. They just stood there, staring toward the front door. Then slowly, they turned their head toward the camera. I couldn't see their face, just a dark void under the hood. But somehow, I felt their gaze. A cold chill crept up my spine as the static on the TV grew louder, crackling like a distant storm. I grabbed the remote and flipped to another channel, desperate to escape the unsettling image. The screen changed to a cheerful infomercial about Christmas cookie cutters. I exhaled, letting the brightness of the scene calm my nerves. But as I stared at the new channel, something in my peripheral vision made me turn back. The black and white footage was still there. The figure was still there. And they were walking again, closer to the house, closer to me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the remote, trying to turn the TV off. But the power button didn't work. Neither did the volume. I yanked the power cord from the wall, but the screen stayed on, flickering slightly as the figure reached the driveway. I backed away from the couch, glancing toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I opened them, I'd see someone standing there. The figure on the screen was halfway up the walkway now. They moved slowly, their steps deliberate, as though they were savoring the moment. The static grew louder, almost deafening, as the camera zoomed in on the front door. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. And then, they stopped. The figure stood on the porch facing the door. They reached out, their hand disappearing from view as they knocked, 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed in my chest. I froze, staring at the screen, my mind spinning. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front door. I stared at the TV, the image crackling with static. The figure didn't move. They were still standing on the porch, their hand raised as though frozen mid-knock. Knock, knock, knock. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. Slowly I crept toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stop. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see nothing. But there they were.
The same hooded figure, standing perfectly still on my porch. Their head tilted slightly, as though they knew I was watching. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I turned to look at the TV again, the screen was black, no static, no footage. Just my own reflection staring back at me. The knocking stopped. When I worked up the courage to look through the peephole again, the porch was empty. But the chill in the air told me I wasn't alone. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it, blamed it on stress, sleep deprivation, or some prank I didn't understand. But when I checked the TV,
The plug was still out, and on the porch, just outside the front door, were 3 faint footprints in the snow. They led up to the door, but none led away. It started innocently enough. I'd been working from home on Christmas Eve, sipping coffee while half listening to a virtual meeting, when I first noticed the delivery truck. It was one of those plain white vans, unmarked, no logo, just another nondescript vehicle in a sea of holiday deliveries. I spotted it through the living room window as it rolled down my quiet suburban street. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of boxes being dropped on the porch. Nothing unusual. I figured it was the last of my holiday shopping arriving just in time, but the van didn't leave right away. I glanced up from my laptop to see it idling at the curb, the driver obscured by the sun's glare on the windshield. After a long moment, it pulled away, and I shrugged it off. It wasn't until later that things started to feel off. Around noon, I was taking a break from work, folding laundry in the bedroom, when I heard the low rumble of an engine outside. I looked out the window and saw the same van. It moved slowly, creeping past my house like it was looking for something or someone. It didn't stop this time. It rolled to the end of the street, turned around, and passed by again, its engine growling softly in the cold air. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The holidays were busy for delivery drivers, and maybe the driver was just lost or trying to double-check addresses. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. By mid-afternoon, I saw it again. And again. The third time it passed, I stood at the window, watching it move down the street. It didn't deliver anything this time. It just slowed near my house, its driver's side window cracked open before speeding off. That evening, after the sun had set and the neighborhood lights flickered on, I tried to push the strange occurrences out of my mind. I wrapped presents in the living room, the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner, and tried to focus on the hum of holiday music playing in the background. I didn't notice the truck again until after dinner. I was washing dishes when I caught a glimpse of headlights through the kitchen window. The van was parked at the far end of the street, its engine off, the shadowy outline of the driver just barely visible behind the wheel. My stomach twisted. It had been hours since I'd seen it last, and now it was just sitting there. I grabbed my phone and debated whether to call someone. The police? They'd think I was overreacting. My husband. He was at his office's holiday party and wouldn't be home until late. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing. Just a tired delivery driver catching a break before their next stop. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The knocking started around 9 p.m. I was sitting on the couch trying to lose myself in a movie when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the front door. They echoed through the quiet house, making me jump. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't unusual to get late-night deliveries this time of year, but something about those knocks felt wrong, tentative, too deliberate. I got up slowly and peeked through the curtains. The porch was empty. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating through the stillness. I checked the peephole, half expecting to see someone standing there with a package in hand. But there was no one. I stepped back from the door, my breath coming faster. My first thought was the van. I turned off the lights in the living room, making it harder for anyone outside to see in, and crept to the window. The street was dark except for the soft glow of Christmas lights. But there, at the far end, I saw it. The van. It was parked under a street lamp, its headlights off, but I could see the faint outline of someone sitting inside. The figure didn't move, didn't open the door or step out. They just sat there, watching. Another knock came, this time from the back door.
I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears. I moved to the kitchen, trying to stay quiet, and peered out the window above the sink. The backyard was empty, blanketed in untouched snow. But the sound had been real, louder and closer than before. I grabbed my phone and dialed my husband. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. My fingers trembled as I tried to decide what to do next. Call the police? Run to a neighbor's house? I didn't know where the van's driver was or if they were alone. The knock came again, softer now, like someone dragging their knuckles across the wood. I dropped the phone and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy ceramic mug from the counter, and moved toward the back door. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned close, trying to see outside. Nothing. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me, and then froze. There, pressed into the snow just beyond the porch, were footprints. They led up to the door, but there were no tracks leading away. I didn't sleep that night. I left all the lights on and sat in the corner of the living room with my phone in my lap, waiting for my husband to come home. By the time he arrived, the van was gone, the street empty, except for the faint glow of holiday lights. The next morning, I checked the security camera I'd installed on the porch earlier that year. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the footage, half dreading what I'd see. The video showed the van passing my house several times throughout the day. At night, the knocks started, just as I'd heard them. But each time I played the clip, the camera showed the same thing. No one at the door. Just the sound of knocking, echoing through the cold December air. Christmas Eve brought a snowstorm that blanketed the neighborhood in silence. By the time it passed, everything was coated in thick, powdery drifts, the streetlights casting a cold yellow glow over the icy landscape. The world felt muffled, like the snow had swallowed every sound. It was nearly midnight when I decided to clear the driveway. The forecast had promised more snow by morning, and I figured I'd get a head start. My wife and kids were already asleep, and the quiet night seemed perfect for the task. I bundled up, grabbed my shovel, and stepped into the freezing air. The only sound was the rhythmic scrape of metal against concrete as I worked my way down the driveway. I didn't notice the car at first, not until I paused to stretch and caught a glimpse of it through the falling snow. It was parked at the far end of the street, partially obscured by a street lamp's flickering light. A dark sedan, its engine running, the faint glow of its taillights cutting through the storm. I figured it was someone stuck in the snow, or maybe a neighbor waiting for a tow truck. The storm had made a mess of the roads, after all. I turned back to my work, telling myself it wasn't unusual, but as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the car was off. By the time I finished the driveway, the snow had picked up again, falling in heavy, wet flakes. I leaned on the shovel, my breath clouding the air as I glanced back toward the car. It hadn't moved. Its taillights still glowed faintly, the exhaust curling upward like a ghostly trail. I squinted, trying to see inside, but the windows were fogged over, obscuring whatever, or whoever, was inside. The engine was still running,
the low hum just barely audible over the wind. It struck me as odd that no one had stepped out, not even to check the tires or wave someone down for help. I thought about going over to see if they needed anything. Maybe they were waiting for a ride, or maybe they'd fallen asleep. But something about the way the car sat there, still and silent, made my skin crawl. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of the house was comforting, but I couldn't shake the image of the car at the end of the street. I told myself it was nothing. Someone had probably just left their car running while they went to check on something. But as I got ready for bed, I found myself peeking out the front window again. The car was still there, the faint red of its taillights glowing through the thickening snow. "Is everything okay?" my wife murmured sleepily from the bedroom. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just checking the driveway." I didn't tell her about the car. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, a faint humming, almost imperceptible, but enough to pull me from sleep. I got out of bed and went to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered outside. The car hadn't moved. It was still parked at the end of the street, its engine running, its taillights glowing faintly through the storm. The snow had nearly buried the wheels, but the car itself looked untouched. No tracks leading to or from it, no sign of anyone getting out. I grabbed a flashlight and my coat, telling myself I was just going to check on it. If someone was in trouble, I couldn't just leave them out there. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my way down the street, the cold biting at my face. The car's engine grew louder as I approached, a low, steady hum that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. When I reached the driver's side door, I shined the flashlight into the window. The beam cut through the fogged glass, illuminating an empty interior. No driver, no passengers, just a running engine and a faint smell of exhaust. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. I walked around the car, checking the other doors, but they were all locked. The snow around the vehicle was untouched, the drifts pristine except for the small patch melted by the exhaust pipe. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what that meant. No one had driven it here. I hurried back to the house, my heart pounding. Once inside, I locked the door and drew the curtains, trying to ignore the creeping dread crawling up my spine. I told myself I'd call the non-emergency line in the morning, let the police figure it out. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening for the faint hum of the engine, half expecting to hear footsteps crunching through the snow outside. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The street was bathed in the soft light of a winter morning, and everything looked calm and peaceful. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I opened the curtains, the car was still there. It was buried in snow now, the taillights barely visible under the thick white blanket. The engine had finally stopped, leaving it silent and still. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my coat and boots and went outside, my breath fogging the air as I approached the car again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a single faint handprint on the inside of the driver's side window. The snow was undisturbed, the car still locked, and there were no footprints leading away. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. Just a patch of melted snow where it had been, steam rising faintly into the cold morning air. I still don't know who or what was in that car. But every Christmas Eve since, when the snow falls heavy and the streets go quiet, I find myself glancing out the window, just in case it comes back.
Christmas morning was perfect, or at least it started that way. The boys raced around the living room, their laughter bubbling over as wrapping paper flew in every direction. Dana sipped coffee from her favorite mug, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the kitchen. The tree stood in the corner, tall and proud, its lights twinkling against the glass ornaments. It was one of the best trees we'd ever had, full, symmetrical, and fresh enough to fill the room with the crisp scent of pine. The kids had spent hours decorating it, and even now, their homemade ornaments dangled unevenly alongside the shiny store-bought ones. It was perfect. Almost. "Don't forget the wreath," Dana called from the kitchen, her voice light. The boys bolted toward the door, their excitement contagious. Every year, we hid little surprises in the wreath on the front door. Candy, tiny toys, and handwritten notes. I'd stuffed them in last night after everyone had gone to bed, double-checking to make sure everything was perfect. "Dad," one of them shouted, "there's something weird in here." I walked to the foyer, frowning as my youngest held out a piece of paper. It wasn't one of the notes I'd left. This paper was different, crumpled, yellowed, and damp around the edges, like it had been exposed to the elements. It smelled faintly of earth and rust, a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. "What is it?" Dana asked, joining us in the foyer. I unfolded the paper slowly. The brittle edges crackled as I revealed the words written in dark, jagged letters. "Beautiful tree. Be careful what you hide beneath it." The handwriting was uneven, the strokes deep and forceful, as though they'd been carved into the page. The ink wasn't ordinary either. It gleamed faintly under the light, black with a hint of red like dried blood. Dana's face tightened. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice low. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I don't know where it came from." Her eyes flicked toward the boys, then back to me. "It's probably just a prank," she said, though the edge in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Yeah," I agreed quickly. "Just some kid messing around." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. Who would go to the trouble of hiding a note in our wreath? And why? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of excitement. The boys tore through their presents, oblivious to the strange note. But Dana and I couldn't stop glancing at the tree. The words on the paper stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Dana and I sat in the living room. The tree's lights reflected softly on the windows, casting warm, flickering shadows across the room. "What do you think it meant?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. Probably nothing. Just some bored teenager trying to freak people out. She didn't respond right away. Her gaze lingered on the tree, then shifted to the neatly wrapped presents piled underneath it. "It felt personal," she said finally. "Like whoever wrote it knew us." I woke up around midnight to a sound, a faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. It came again, softer this time, from the living room. I grabbed my robe and crept down the hallway, the silence pressing in on me. The tree's lights glowed faintly, their reflections darting across the ornaments like tiny eyes watching from the dark. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed one of the presents. The silver-wrapped box, the largest one under the tree, had moved. It sat at an angle now, the corner of the wrapping paper torn slightly. I crouched down, hesitating before touching it. My hand trembled as I peeled back the torn edge. Inside wasn't the toy we'd wrapped for the boys.
It was something else entirely. A twisted branch, blackened and brittle, its bark splintered as though scorched by fire. Thin, spindly roots curled around it, sharp and dry like claws. A bead of sauté foliadec ragad alfahos, zagja eles es fems maidne minta ver. The air seemed colder now, my breath fogging faintly in the dim light. I stood quickly, heart pounding, and looked around the room. The tree's lights flickered once, then steadied, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The next morning I told Dana about the branch. She stared at me, her expression wavering between disbelief and fear. "Are you sure no one came into the house?" she asked. "The doors were locked, the windows too." I paused. "It doesn't make sense." Her gaze drifted toward the tree, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tightly I thought it might crack. "What do we do?" "We get rid of it," I said firmly. "The tree, the wreath, all of it." We spent New Year's Day dismantling the decorations. The boys protested, but even they seemed uneasy, casting nervous glances at the tree as we hauled it outside. Its needles were brittle now, the branches sagging as though the tree had aged years in a matter of days. When I went to take down the wreath, I found another note tucked into the branches. The handwriting was the same, jagged and uneven, but this message was shorter. "You didn't listen." We didn't get a real tree the next year, or the year after that. The boys complained about the artificial tree at first, but they got used to it. It doesn't smell like pine, but I don't care. At least I know what's under it. And every Christmas I check the wreath before we hang it, just in case. Christmas shopping was a nightmare. I'd been weaving through the mall crowds for over an hour, arms aching from bags stuffed with last-minute gifts. Holiday music blared from every direction, festive and cloying, while families bustled between stores, their laughter rising above the din. It should have been cheerful, but it all felt overwhelming, too bright, too loud. I stopped at a bench near the atrium to catch my breath. The center of the mall was decked out with oversized wreaths, strings of lights, and a towering Christmas tree that sparkled with ornaments. Beneath it, the big attraction, Santa Claus. The line to meet him snaked around the display, kids fidgeting in line as their parents snapped photos. The Santa actor looked the part, rosy cheeks, twinkling eyes, a full white beard that could have been real. He leaned in close to a little boy on his lap, smiling warmly as he whispered something. The boy giggled, and the parents beamed. It was a sweet moment, the kind you'd expect during the holidays. Then Santa looked up, and his eyes locked on mine. The moment stretched longer than it should have. His face stayed frozen in that friendly, Santa-like smile. But his eyes, there was something off about them. They were too sharp, too aware, and they bore into me as though he were searching for something. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing behind me to see if someone else had caught his attention. But no, his gaze stayed fixed on me. I turned back toward the store I'd been heading to, trying to shake the feeling. He's just zoning out. It's crowded. Coincidence. But as I glanced back one last time, he was still watching, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. A shiver crawled up my spine. I ducked into the store and forced myself to focus on my shopping. The mall was emptier when I finally left. It was late now, the long lines gone, but the festive decorations still glimmered under the overhead lights. The dark parking lot stretched out ahead of me, quiet except for the occasional crunch of footsteps and the hum of car engines warming in the cold. I found my car near the far end of the lot, where spaces had been plentiful, but the lighting sparse. Balancing my bags in one hand, I fumbled for my keys. That's when I saw it. A folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. I froze, the weight of my bags suddenly forgotten. My first thought was a flyer, but something about the way it was folded felt deliberate. I glanced around quickly, the cold air stinging my cheeks. The lot was nearly empty, just rows of parked cars and the faint glow of street lamps. No one was nearby. With shaking hands, I plucked the paper from the windshield and unfolded it. The writing was jagged and uneven, scrawled across the page in black ink. "Nice seeing you again."
My breath caught. The words felt personal, too direct to be random. Again? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't know anyone here. But then an image flashed in my mind. The Santa actor, his eyes fixed on mine from across the atrium. I stuffed the note into my pocket, threw my bags into the car, and locked the doors as soon as I slid into the driver's seat. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, the soft rumble breaking the eerie silence of the lot. As I drove away, I couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror. Every set of headlights felt like they were following me, every shadow stretching too long in the glow of the street lamps. By the time I reached my driveway, my chest was tight with nerves. At home, I locked the doors and turned on every light in the house. The note burned in my pocket, its words replaying in my mind. "Nice seeing you again." What did it mean? Had I seen him before? Was it someone I'd passed without noticing? Someone who'd remembered me? I tried to distract myself with mindless scrolling, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, searching the dark for movement. The Christmas tree lights cast flickering shadows across the room, but the warmth they usually brought felt cold and distant now. Just after midnight, a soft knock broke the silence. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The knock came again, 3 light taps, deliberate and precise. I crept toward the front door, my breath shallow, and pressed my eye to the peephole. The porch was empty. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and suffocating. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, I unlocked the door and opened it, my hand trembling. There was no one there, but on the doormat was another note. I picked it up with numb fingers, my heart pounding as I unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, jagged and uneven, but the words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "See you soon." I barely slept that night, every sound in the house setting my nerves on edge. I checked the locks 3 times before finally collapsing into bed, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I dreamed of Santa's eyes, staring at me from behind that fake beard, sharp and knowing. In the morning, I searched for signs of footprints on the porch, but the frost was undisturbed. The note was the only trace of anyone being there. It's been weeks since then, but the fear hasn't faded. Every time I go out, I feel eyes on me. At the grocery store, in the parking lot, even at work. I've stopped going to malls altogether, and every night I double-check the locks, just in case he comes back. The call came while we were at the store, but we didn't know it yet. All we knew was that Christmas shopping was chaos. The grocery aisles were packed, carts jammed with last-minute essentials for holiday feasts. Emily muttered about cranberries as she scanned the shelves, her list crumpled in one hand and a box of stuffing in the other.
I pushed the cart, dodging overexcited kids and frustrated parents, half tuning out the endless loop of Christmas music blaring over the speakers. "This is a madhouse," she sighed, tossing the stuffing into the cart. "Next year," I said, smiling faintly. We both knew we'd leave it until the last minute again next year. It was tradition at this point. As we turned down another aisle, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a spam call or a holiday text. My stomach dropped. The screen read, "Home calling." I stared at the phone, the cheerful ringtone clashing with the sudden chill in my chest. "It's the house," I said aloud, holding up the screen for Emily to see. Her brow furrowed. "That's weird. Maybe a glitch?" "Yeah," I said, though my voice didn't feel steady. I pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" Silence. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice louder now. A faint crackle of static buzzed on the other end, but no one spoke. I waited, straining to hear any sound, but the line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at it as the screen blinked back to my home screen. No one was there. "Probably nothing," Emily said, though her tone wasn't as casual as her words. She glanced at the list. "Let's finish up and get home." I nodded, sliding the phone back into my pocket, but the knot in my stomach didn't ease. No one else had a key to our house. No one was supposed to be there. The lot was dark by the time we loaded the groceries into the car. The snow had started again, light flakes catching in the glow of the streetlights. As I pulled out onto the quiet road, I felt the faint prickle of unease returning. The house was dark when we arrived, just the soft glow of the porch light illuminating the snow-dusted walkway. Everything looked as we'd left it, but something about the stillness felt wrong. "Do you think we should check the phone?" Emily asked as we brought the bags inside. "What for?" I said, though I already knew what she meant. "To see if it called again." The landline sat on the kitchen counter, a relic we kept more out of habit than necessity. Emily picked up the receiver, scrolling through the caller ID history. Her face tightened. "It's here," she said, turning the screen toward me. "The call came from the house at 6:32. I glanced at the clock. That was 20 minutes after we'd left for the store. My chest tightened. "Maybe it's a glitch," I said, though I didn't believe it. She didn't answer, her gaze flicking toward the darkened hallway. "What if someone's inside?" I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer. "Stay here," I said, though my heart was pounding. "I'll check the house." I started in the living room. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner, its lights reflecting off the ornaments we'd carefully hung last weekend. Everything was as we'd left it. The presents still piled neatly beneath the tree, the stockings hung by the fireplace. I moved down the hallway, checking each room in turn. The bathroom, the guest bedroom, the laundry room, all empty. The air felt colder as I approached the basement door. I hesitated, my hand on the knob. The basement light didn't work, so I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it down the stairs. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the cluttered space below. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing faintly. No response. I searched the basement, checking behind shelves and boxes, but found nothing. Just the faint hum of the water heater and the smell of old wood. By the time I climbed back upstairs, I felt equal parts relief and frustration. There was no one here. But as I entered the kitchen, I froze. The phone was off the hook. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed to the phone. "It was back on the cradle when you checked it, right?"
"Yes," she whispered, her face pale. Before I could respond, the phone rang. The sharp, shrill sound made both of us jump. The caller ID lit up again. Home calling. Neither of us moved. The ringing continued, each tone slicing through the heavy silence. On the fifth ring, I grabbed the receiver and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" At first there was nothing, just silence. Then faint and rhythmic I heard it. Breathing, slow, deliberate, and steady. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The breathing stopped. A low, rasping whisper followed, the word cutting through the static. "Home." I slammed the receiver down, my hands trembling. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "They said, 'Home,'" I managed, the word tasting wrong as I spoke it. We didn't sleep that night. We locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and kept every light in the house on. The next morning, we called the phone company, desperate for answers. "There's no record of any outgoing calls from your number," the representative said. "Are you sure it wasn't a mistake?" I hung up, the knot in my chest tightening further. We changed the locks, installed cameras, even got rid of the landline altogether. But it didn't help. Every Christmas Eve since, I catch myself glancing toward the counter where the phone used to sit, straining to hear a ring that no longer comes. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear it, faint and rhythmic, a whisper of breathing that doesn't belong.